In the spring of 451, on a blood-soaked plain in Armenia, a small nation made a choice that would echo through centuries. They chose to fight an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to India. They chose to stand against an army that had never been defeated. They chose death over submission, faith over survival, martyrdom over compromise. The Sassanid Persian Empire demanded they abandon Christianity and embrace Zoroastrianism. The Armenians said no. The odds were impossible. Perhaps 66,000 Armenian warriors faced over 200,000 Persian soldiers. Cavalry, war elephants, and the most sophisticated military machine in the world bore down on them. The Persian commander, a general who had crushed a dozen rebellions, was confident of easy victory. The Armenians, led by a warrior saint named Vardan Mamikonian, knew they would likely die. They came to the battlefield anyway, carrying crosses alongside their swords, singing hymns as they prepared for war. When the sun rose over Avarayr on May 26, 451, two civilizations collided. Persian fire against Armenian steel. Empire against faith. The battle that followed was not the largest in history, not the most strategically important, not the one that decided the fate of kingdoms. But it was something rarer and more precious. It was a battle where a people chose who they would be, even if it meant ceasing to exist. Where faith proved stronger than fear. Where losing became a victory that would inspire millions for over 1,500 years. This is the story of Avarayr. The stand that saved a soul, the defeat that became a triumph. The day when Armenia bled to remain Armenian, and in that blood found immortality. For nearly 2 centuries, Armenia had existed in the dangerous space between two empires. To the west lay Rome, later Byzantium, the Christian empire that saw Armenia as a buffer state and sometimes an ally. To the east stretched the Sassanid Persian Empire, a Zoroastrian power that viewed Armenia as rightfully Persian territory, temporarily lost but eventually to be reclaimed. Armenia had been the first nation to officially adopt Christianity as a state religion in 301 AD, over a decade before Constantine's conversion made Christianity acceptable in Rome. This was not a political decision imposed from above. Christianity had spread through Armenia's mountains and valleys, converting nobles and peasants alike, becoming woven into the fabric of Armenian identity. The Church gave Armenians their alphabet, their literature, their sense of being a distinct people with a divine purpose. By the early 5th century, Armenia was nominally independent but increasingly under Persian influence. The Sassanid Shahs, while tolerant of other religions within their diverse empire, grew nervous about a Christian kingdom on their border. Christianity meant cultural ties to Rome and Byzantium. It meant Armenian nobles looking west for inspiration and support. It meant a population whose ultimate loyalty might not be to the Shah of Shahs. The Sassanid ruler Yazdegerd II, who came to power in 439, was more aggressive than his predecessors. He faced threats on his eastern borders from nomadic invasions and needed to secure his western territories. He also believed deeply in Zoroastrianism and saw the spread of Christianity as a threat to Persian culture and unity. Armenia, with its strategic location and its increasingly confident Christian identity, became a target. Initially, Yazdegerd tried persuasion and pressure. He invited Armenian nobles to the Persian capital, showered them with gifts and honors, and politely but firmly suggested they might consider adopting Zoroastrianism. Many Armenian nobles, called Nakurs, were uncomfortable. They held lands from the Persian Shah. They served in his armies. They depended on his goodwill for their power and wealth. Open defiance could mean the loss of everything. Some nobles wavered. The pressure was immense, and the benefits of compliance were real. Persian favor meant land, titles, and protection. Christian faith meant potential poverty, exile, or death. It was not an easy choice, and those who wrestled with it were not cowards. They were men trying to balance duty to their families, their positions, and their faith. But other nobles, led by Vardan Mamikonian, refused to compromise. Vardan came from one of Armenia's most powerful families. He was a military commander who had fought in Persian campaigns and understood exactly how powerful the empire was. He was not a naive idealist or a religious fanatic. He was a pragmatic warrior who had seen the world and chosen his faith with full knowledge of the cost. Vardan argued that Christianity was not simply a religion Armenians practiced. It was who Armenians were. To abandon it would be to abandon their identity, their culture, their souls. Better to die as Armenians than to live as Persians. His words resonated with many nobles, with the clergy, and with common people who saw their faith as the foundation of everything they valued. By 449, the situation had deteriorated. Yazdegerd's patience ended. He sent an ultimatum to Armenia: convert to Zoroastrianism or face the full might of the Persian military. He sent Zoroastrian priests to begin forcibly converting the population. He ordered Armenian nobles to attend Zoroastrian ceremonies and publicly renounce Christianity. He made it clear this was not a request but a command backed by the largest army in the world. The Armenian nobles gathered in councils, debating what to do. Some argued for submission. They pointed out that Rome had abandoned them, that Byzantium was fighting its own wars and would send no help, that resistance meant certain death. They were not wrong. Armenia stood alone against a superpower. But Vardan and those who stood with him made a different argument. They said that some things mattered more than survival, that a people who gave up their faith gave up their reason for existing, that it was better to fight and die than to live as something you were not, that faith required sacrifice, and if God called them to martyrdom, they would answer that call. The debate was intense, emotional, and deeply painful. These were not abstract philosophical questions. Every man present knew that choosing resistance meant probable death, not just for themselves but for their families, their clans, their people. It was the hardest decision imaginable. In the end, enough nobles sided with Vardan that resistance became possible. They sent word to Yazdegerd that Armenia would not convert. They began preparing for war, gathering weapons, training soldiers, fortifying positions. They sent messengers to Byzantine territories, pleading for help, but received only sympathy and promises, never troops. They were alone. The Armenian Church played a crucial role in the resistance. Priests preached that martyrdom for faith was the highest calling. They reminded congregations of the early Christian martyrs who had died rather than worship Roman gods. They said Armenia was being tested by God, and failing this test would mean losing their souls even if they saved their lives. The faith that had defined Armenia for 150 years now demanded the ultimate sacrifice. Women supported the resistance as vocally as men. Armenian noblewomen encouraged their husbands and sons to fight. They donated wealth to equip soldiers. Some reportedly said they would rather be widows of martyrs than wives of apostates. The entire society, not just the military, was mobilizing for a war they knew they would probably lose. Yazdegerd received Armenia's refusal with fury. He had given them a chance to submit peacefully. They had thrown the chance away. Now they would learn what happened to those who defied the King of Kings. He ordered his generals to assemble an army, not just large enough to defeat the Armenian rebels, but large enough to annihilate them so thoroughly that no one would ever dare resist Persia again. The army that marched toward Armenia in early 451 was massive even by Persian standards. Sources vary wildly, but most historians estimate between 150,000 and 220,000 soldiers. The core was Persian regular army, professional soldiers who had fought across Asia. There were cavalry units from different satrapies, each with their own fighting styles and equipment. War elephants, armored beasts that terrified enemies and broke formations, marched with the army. And leading them was Mushkin Nizilvert, a veteran general known for ruthlessness and skill. The Armenians knew the Persian army was coming. Scouts reported its size, and any hope that Yazdegerd might change his mind vanished. Vardan gathered every fighting man Armenia could muster. Nobles brought their retainers. Mountain clans sent warriors. Even some clergy took up weapons, arguing that defending the faith was holy work even if it meant killing. The Armenian army that finally assembled numbered perhaps 60,000 to 66,000 men. Most were cavalry, as was traditional for Armenian warfare. They were skilled horsemen, experienced fighters, and absolutely committed to their cause. They knew the odds. They came anyway, because to stay home meant abandoning everything they believed in. Vardan chose to make his stand on the plain of Avarayr in the Artaz region of Armenia. It was not ideal ground for the defenders. The open terrain favored the larger Persian force and their elephants. But Vardan understood that retreating into the mountains would only delay the inevitable. If Armenia was going to make a stand, it needed to be a clear, unmistakable declaration that they would fight rather than submit, even against impossible odds. On May 25, 451, the two armies camped within sight of each other. The Persians, confident and numerous, prepared for what they assumed would be a quick victory. The Armenians, outnumbered and aware of their likely fate, spent the night in prayer. Vardan moved among his men, encouraging them, reminding them why they fought, assuring them that death in defense of faith was not defeat but victory. The Armenian priests held services throughout the night. Men confessed their sins, took communion, and prepared their souls for death. It was not morbid or despairing. There was a sense of purpose, almost of joy, that they had been chosen for this moment. They would stand for Christ. They would defend their people. And if they died doing so, they would die as Armenians and as Christians, which was all that mattered. As dawn broke on May 26, 451, Vardan Mamikonian addressed his army one final time. Ancient sources record variations of his speech, but all capture its essence. He told his men that they were not fighting for land or wealth or power. They were fighting for their souls. That the Persians could kill their bodies, but could not touch their faith. That every man standing on that field was already victorious because he had chosen Christ over comfort, death over apostasy. And that generations yet unborn would remember this day and draw strength from it. The Armenian army roared its approval. They formed into their battle lines, cavalry in the center and wings, smaller infantry units supporting them. They blessed their weapons, made the sign of the cross, and waited for the Persian attack. Across the plain, Mushkin-Nizaverd surveyed his massive army and felt confident. He had overwhelming numbers, better equipment, war elephants, and the backing of the greatest empire in the world. The Armenians were brave, he acknowledged, but bravery without numbers was just a faster path to death. He ordered the attack. The Persian army advanced like a tidal wave. Infantry marched in the center, their shields creating a wall of steel. Cavalry moved on the wings, preparing to encircle the smaller Armenian force. And in front of everything came the war elephants, massive beasts armored and trained for battle, their very presence designed to terrify and break enemy morale. The Armenians watched them come. They had never faced war elephants in such numbers before. The sight and sound must have been overwhelming, but they did not break. They did not flee. They stood their ground, and when the Persian army came within range, they charged. The Armenian cavalry thundered forward to meet the Persian advance. It was not a cautious, defensive engagement. It was a full commitment, an all-out assault designed to strike hard and fast before Persian numbers could fully deploy. Vardan led from the front, his banner visible, his courage inspiring every man who saw him. The two armies crashed together with earth-shaking violence. The sound of thousands of horses colliding, of steel on steel, of men shouting and dying, created a cacophony that drowned out thought. The Armenian charge hit the Persian center with devastating force, driving deep into their formation, disrupting their careful deployment. For a moment, the Persians wavered. The Armenians were fighting with a ferocity born of desperation and faith. They were not trying to win in any conventional sense. They were trying to prove something, to themselves, to their enemy, to God. Every Armenian who fell died knowing why he was there and what he was dying for. The Persian cavalry on the wings moved to encircle the Armenians as Mushkin had planned. The war elephants, having absorbed the initial shock, began to push forward, their bulk and armor making them nearly unstoppable. The Persian infantry, recovering from the first Armenian charge, began to press forward in organized waves. The battle became a brutal grind. The Armenians, already outnumbered, found themselves being surrounded on all sides. They formed defensive circles, backs to each other, fighting against enemies from every direction. The sun climbed higher, beating down on men in armor, making every movement exhausting, every breath painful. Vardan Mamikonian was everywhere, rallying his men, leading charges to break through Persian encirclements, refusing to let his army collapse into panic. Around him, his closest companions and relatives fought with the same desperate courage. They knew this was not a battle they could win by traditional measures. But they could win it by refusing to surrender, by standing until they could stand no more. Hours passed. The plain of Avarayr became a slaughterhouse. Armenian casualties mounted as Persian numbers began to tell. Units that had fought brilliantly were ground down by waves of fresh Persian troops. The encirclement tightened. Escape became impossible for most of the Armenian force. And then, in the late afternoon, Vardan Mamikonian fell. Accounts differ on exactly how he died. Some say he was struck down leading a charge. Others claim he fought surrounded by enemies until sheer exhaustion and wounds brought him down. What is certain is that the man who had led the Armenian resistance, who had inspired his people to choose faith over survival, died on the battlefield of Avarayr, his blood soaking into Armenian soil. His death could have broken the Armenian army. Instead, it seemed to inspire them to even greater sacrifice. Knowing their leader had given everything, knowing they fought now to honor his memory as much as defend their faith, the remaining Armenians fought on with even more ferocious determination. But courage, no matter how great, cannot indefinitely overcome overwhelming numbers. As evening approached, the Armenian army was being systematically destroyed. Pockets of resistance remained, surrounded and fighting, but the battle was clearly lost. Persian cavalry hunted down the survivors. The elephants trampled through broken formations. The Persian infantry methodically finished wounded enemies. By sunset, the Battle of Avarayr was over. The Armenian army had been shattered. Perhaps 9,000 to 10,000 Armenians lay dead on the plain, including Vardan and many of Armenia's greatest nobles. The survivors, scattered and broken, fled into the mountains or surrendered. The Persian army, though it had suffered significant casualties of its own, perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 dead, stood victorious on the field. Mushkin Nizlevert surveyed the battlefield and declared victory. The Armenian rebellion had been crushed. The resistors were dead or scattered. Now Armenia would be fully integrated into the Persian Empire. Its people converted to Zoroastrianism, its dangerous Christian identity erased. But something strange happened in the aftermath of Avarayr. Something that turned military defeat into spiritual and cultural victory. The Persians had won the battle, but discovered they could not win the war. The Armenian resistance, rather than being crushed by defeat, became more determined. Guerrilla warfare broke out across Armenia. Persian officials were assassinated. Zoroastrian priests sent to convert the population were driven out or killed. The population, inspired by Vardan's martyrdom, refused to convert no matter what force was applied. Yazdegerd found himself in an impossible situation. He could station huge numbers of troops in Armenia permanently, draining resources needed elsewhere, to forcibly maintain control over a hostile population. Or he could acknowledge that Armenians would not abandon their faith, no matter the cost. The Battle of Avarayr had not broken Armenian resistance. It had crystallized it, given it a martyr and a story that made compromise impossible. Meanwhile, Persia faced growing threats on its eastern borders. Nomadic invasions required military attention and resources. Yazdegerd could not afford to keep a massive army in Armenia indefinitely, and anything less than a massive army was insufficient to control the rebellious population. In 484, 33 years after Avarayr, Persia effectively admitted defeat. The Treaty of Invarsik granted Armenia religious freedom. Armenians would remain under Persian political control, but could practice Christianity without interference. The Persians even agreed to fund the construction of churches. It was an extraordinary concession for an empire that had never before retreated from a demand. Avarayr had accomplished something nearly unique in history. The Armenians had lost the battle but won the war. Their willingness to die rather than convert had proven to the Persians that Christian Armenia could not be peacefully integrated into a Zoroastrian empire. The cost of forcing conversion was higher than Persia was willing to pay. Vardan Mamikonian and his companions who fell at Avarayr were venerated as saints by the Armenian Church. Their feast day became one of the most important in the Armenian calendar. Churches across Armenia were dedicated to them. Their story was told to every generation of Armenian children as an example of courage, faith, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for what matters most. The Battle of Avarayr became the defining moment of Armenian identity. It established that being Armenian meant being Christian, and that this identity was worth dying for. When Armenia faced later invasions, later attempts at forced conversion by Arabs, Mongols, Turks, and others, the memory of Avarayr sustained them. Their ancestors had stood against an empire and refused to surrender their faith. How could any later generation do less? The battle also inspired other Christian communities facing persecution. The story of Armenian martyrdom spread through the Christian world. It showed that faith could triumph even in defeat, that the willingness to die rather than compromise had power beyond military victory. In later centuries, when Christians faced persecution from Islamic empires or communist regimes, the example of Avarayr was invoked as proof that faith could survive anything. From a military perspective, Avarayr demonstrated that some things cannot be taken by force. The Persians had superior numbers, better equipment, more resources, and they won the battlefield decisively. But they could not conquer Armenian faith. They could kill bodies, but not souls. The very completeness of their military victory made their strategic defeat more obvious. If even annihilating the Armenian army could not make Armenians convert, what could? The battle also showed the power of narrative and identity. The Armenians fought at Avarayr not to win in any traditional military sense, but to establish a story, to create a moment that would define their people forever. They succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. 1,500 years later, every Armenian knows about Avarayr. The battle lost on May 26, 451, has been winning ever since. Modern historians debate various aspects of the battle. The exact numbers are uncertain. The tactical details are sometimes contradictory in the sources. Some scholars argue that the battle's importance has been exaggerated by nationalist sentiment and religious devotion. But what cannot be disputed is the battle's effect. After Avarayr, Armenia remained Christian. After Avarayr, Armenians had a foundational story of sacrifice and faith that sustained them through centuries of invasions, occupations, and attempted genocides. The plain of Avarayr today is in Iran in the Salmas region near Lake Urmia. There is no grand monument, no tourist attraction marking where one of history's most important battles was fought. But for Armenians worldwide, it remains sacred ground. The place where Vardan fell, where thousands died for faith, where a people chose their identity over their lives and, in that choice, achieved a victory that no army could give them. Walking that ground today, you would see farmers' fields and quiet villages. The blood has long since washed away. The bodies are dust. Nothing visible remains of that May Day in 451, when two armies clashed and a civilization was defined. But if you know the story, if you understand what happened there, the plain speaks volumes. It speaks of courage in the face of impossible odds, of faith stronger than fear of death, of a people who valued their souls more than their bodies, their identity more than their survival. It speaks of Vardan Mamikonian, who led his men into a battle he knew they would lose because some things are worth dying for, of thousands of warriors who followed him, not because they thought they would win, but because they refused to be anything other than what they were. Avarayr reminds us that history is not just about who wins battles. It is about what those battles mean, what they create, what they inspire. The Persians won at Avarayr. They killed most of the Armenian army, occupied the country, and seemed to have crushed the rebellion completely. But in the long run, they lost everything they fought for. Armenia remained Christian. The battle they won became the reason for their ultimate defeat. For Armenia, Avarayr became the moment when a people discovered what they were made of. When they learned that they could endure anything, survive anything, as long as they held on to their faith and identity. The stand at Avarayr did not just preserve Christianity in Armenia. It created the idea of Armenian nationhood, the sense that Armenians were a people with a divine purpose, chosen to witness to their faith no matter the cost. 1,500 years later, when the Ottoman Empire attempted to annihilate the Armenian people in 1915, when over 1 million Armenians were murdered in the first genocide of the 20th century, the survivors held on to their identity. They remembered Avarayr. They remembered that their ancestors had faced annihilation before and refused to disappear. That memory helped them survive, to rebuild, to preserve their culture and faith even in diaspora. Today, Armenia is once again an independent nation, the first in the world to declare Christianity its state religion, just as it was the first to do so 1700 years ago. That continuity, that unbroken thread of identity and faith traces back to May 26, 451, to a battlefield where everything seemed lost but everything was actually won. Vardan Mamikonian and his companions did not save Armenia by winning at Avarayr. They saved it by being willing to lose, by showing that some defeats are more powerful than victories, by proving that a people who know who they are and refuse to compromise cannot be conquered, no matter how many battles they lose. That is what really happened at Avarayr. Not just a battle, but a choice. Not just a defeat, but a triumph. Not an ending, but a beginning. The day when Armenia bled, and in that blood found the strength to survive everything history would throw at it. The stand that changed a people, not by succeeding in conventional terms, but by failing so nobly, so completely, so faithfully, that failure itself became victory. And that victory echoes still.